Good day, everybody. Hope everyone had a good weekend and are ready for 4 exciting presentations from students who are on their capstone journey. A few things to note: every presenter will have 30 minutes to both present and respond to questions. And for anyone asking questions, please type the question in the chat window. And for the presenters, please speak the question so that the question can get recorded. So first up, we have Mary Murdoch, who's going to be presenting timber harvest estimations utilizing geospatial techniques. So Mary, whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right, good morning, everybody. Yes, so I will be presenting timber harvest estimations utilizing geospatial techniques. So a little introduction about me. My name is Mary Murdoch. And a little bit about my background prior to beginning my MGIS journey. I graduated from West Virginia University with my bachelor's in forest resource management. I then spent a year with AmeriCorps and CCC. And then after that, I moved back to West Virginia to work for the Division of Forestry, first as a county forester, working in 2 rural counties, doing landowner assistance, wildfire suppression, and logging compliance. I then transitioned to becoming the state lands forester at Cooper's Rock State Forest, which contains the logging site I will focus my research on. I have also just moved back to the States after living in Germany for 2 years with my husband, Michael, and I'm looking forward to completing my degree in the spring. A quick overview of what I'll go over today in my presentation, a general introduction to the project, some background on timber harvesting practices and what goes into the planning, the project data and methodology, some next steps for my project, and potential additional uses and contributions. And then finally, a brief timeline of the rest of my project. Project introduction. So traditional forestry inventories are used to create forest management plans and are complicated and extremely time consuming to create. It can take weeks just to perform general inventories, to estimate volumes and species composition. Of course, with any human-led activity, there is elements of human error. For example, a lot of foresters will rely on ocular estimations for the height of the trees to determine volume calculations, which can lead to some error over time. And it brings up the question of how can geospatial techniques be applied to produce highly accurate volume reports to assist with forest management planning. There are always efforts to create more efficient practices when it comes to inventory techniques. And throughout this evaluation, I will look and test the validity of using high spatial resolution imagery to establish accurate forest timber volumes. The study area I'm going to focus on is Cooper's Rock State Forest. It is located about 10 miles away from Morgantown, West Virginia, which is the home of West Virginia University. It has about just under 13,000 acres, which are split between the university for research and the state, which uses it for mainly recreation, but also timber production for profit, wildlife benefits, and overall forest health. There's a really deep history at Cooper's Rock of logging and industry. There was a lot of iron furnaces in the area around the 1830s, one of which is actually still standing on the property. But essentially that means that the forest was essentially completely clear cut to fuel those furnaces. After that, the Civilian Conservation Corps came in and put a lot of infrastructure in, picnic shelters to increase the recreation portion. And the proximity to the university and the highway with the unique landscape and history resulted in Cooper's Rock being one of the most visited state forests in all of West Virginia. So the study area we're going to look at is one specific logging operation that happened between 2016 to about 2020. These are 2 maps of the logging site I'm going to look at. I actually oversaw the reclamation of a portion of this, so I'm really familiar with the site. On the left is the pre-harvest image, and the right is the post-harvest. The ultimate goal is to compare the volume removed that I'll estimate through the geospatial techniques to the bid sheet, which will indicate the proposed amount of timber that was to be removed. Unfortunately, I don't have the full statistics of what was taken off. The logging process in this region, they don't typically track that or provide it to the public. And those values were collected to produce the bid sheet in a very traditional way of marking timber, which I'll kind of get into the process of that. So we'll do a little bit of background to harvesting and volume estimations. To give an idea of what is required for forest volume estimations, I wanted to go over what it generally takes for forest volume estimations. I have outlined a very general process, and we'll go into details for some of the steps, but essentially some pre-research to establish timber stands, and that can be based off of elevation, the way the land lays. It can be based off of species composition or anything like that. Choosing the inventory method, I'll look at fixed plot and point sampling. You'll perform the inventory, compile the data, and then create a timber management plan. And this is all before the harvest can even begin. So essentially the takeaway is it's very labor intensive. So the question of how to make this more efficient and accurate has been on my mind. And there are tools available, but it takes a lot of training, as you all know. So it will take time to fully implement it into agroforestry practices, but I'm hoping to develop a process that can be used by landowners, loggers, foresters alike. So 2 inventory methods. The first is fixed plot sampling. It uses a uniform plot size throughout the inventory to collect information on species composition, volume, trees per acre, and other relevant statistics to help develop the management plans. This type of inventory is generally better for larger stands that have less variability in the forest composition. So I've attached 2 images to show how the fixed plot sampling works. So the image on the left is an example showing the radius and the boundary. And then to ensure that you're within the plot, you can use a measuring tape or a laser to make sure that you're within the radius. The second image on the right is the in versus out trees that will be inventoried. The blue trees are the ones that you would inventory, and the red would not be inventoried. Another method, and this is the method that was actually used for the inventory on Cooper's Rock, is the variable point sampling. It essentially takes inventory of a percentage of the forest. It's typically faster than the fixed plot, and you will tally less trees per plot. So it allows for more plots to be measured, getting a better picture of the full forest. Tools such as a prism are used, which is shown in this image. It shows how it works, which is it essentially gets a predetermined percentage of the basal area of the forest, and then the prism size utilizes that. So if the tree is offset from the tree trunk, it is an out tree, but if there is overlap, as you see on the left, it is an in tree. So you would tally all the in trees and not the out. And then with the border, it can be a little tricky if it's kind of on the line. So you can use a limiting distance table if there's any question on whether or not it should be counted as in or out. So the data that is collected at each plot, irregardless of the inventory method, the following are typically collected to ensure that the forester gets a clear picture of the forest structure. The diameter, which you can see being done with the yellow tape that is used in the volume calculations, the species, the total height of the tree, the height of the bole or the trunk of the tree, which is what is used to calculate the timber volume. And then depending on the region, multiple products can come out from utilizing the entirety of the tree, but the most valuable part of the tree is the trunk as it produces timber. Understory data is also usually collected just to get an idea of the forest regeneration possibilities. So once all the data is collected, the volume calculations will be done by species and then summarized like this in a bid sheet if it's going up for sale. This is the actual bid sheet from the Cooper's Rock State Forest sale and shows the volume totals by breakdown by species, and then at the bottom, the total. This is, again, the lumber volume, as there's not an incredible market for other products in this region, but there'll be a basis of comparison for the volume data collected from my analysis. As you can see at the bottom of the image, the timber volume estimation is just under 2 million board feet. And board feet is a unit of measure that is used in the US and Canada, and it's essentially the volume of 1 foot in length of a board, 1 foot wide and 1 inch thick, but we can easily convert that into cubic meters. And this 2 million board feet is about 4,719 cubic meters. So now I'll look at my project data and methodology. I will be using both ArcGIS Pro and eCognition for my project with LiDAR and NAPE imagery. The National Agricultural Imagery Program, or NAPE imagery, I have it for my pre and post harvest. It is collected annually and during the leaf on season. It is orthorectified at a resolution of 1 meter GSD. And an added benefit to the application of my study is that it is available to the public with a simple download, which increases the real world application. The light detection and ranging, or LiDAR imagery, will allow me to have the high spatial resolution that will be crucial in determining my volume estimations. I've only been able to find LiDAR imagery for my post-harvest, but I am searching to hopefully find pre-harvest if possible. LiDAR uses GPS, INS, and laser scanners, and has a vertical accuracy of 10 centimeters, which allows us to create high resolution products such as digital elevation models. Essentially, the laser scanners send pulses of light that scatter or reflect back. The amount of time it takes to return indicates how far away the objects, such as buildings or trees, are from the laser. Here is the data I've been able to find for my project so far. The NAPE imagery is from Earth Explorer, and the LiDAR was obtained from the West Virginia Elevation LiDAR download tool. The area of interest for the NAPE imagery for before and after was each covered by one tile, and the LiDAR data for post-harvest was in 3. I have broken down the steps of my methodology into a very basic flow chart. So creating my NDSM, transferring that to eCognition, where I'll segment and classify, clipping out the timber class, estimating before timber volume and after, and then comparing the real world values, which ultimately I hope to develop this into a usable flow chart for foresters or landowners that could easily be followed and apply to forests in their area. This is a methodology for getting my NDSM that I will transfer to eCognition to classify. This is really the basis of the timber volume estimation, so I will go into a little bit more detail here than the other steps. So, of course, downloading the relevant data, extracting if needed, beyond just zip files. Mine was downloaded as a .zlas file, which is essentially a way of compressing the data even more. So I had to extract that on ArcGIS Pro. Then I created an LAS data set using the create LAS data set, then creating my DEM using the make LAS dataset tool. The class code and return values is the important part here for that and the DSM. I converted it to a raster, then created my DSM, changing up my class code and return values, converted that to a raster, and then created my NDSM by using the minus tool to subtract the DEM from the DSM. So this is the buttonology of what I just explained. So I'll just go through this briefly. This part is important. Again, just is how I was able to create and do the classification that I'm hoping to be able to use to create the schema so that this process once again can become more simplified and applied easily to other forest stands on the East Coast. So this is extracting, just making sure you choose the node compression, creating the LAS data set, and then using that with the proper class code and return values to create your DEM. This is mine in the bottom right corner, clipped to the area of interest. I then turned it into a raster and created my DSM. Once again, the class codes and return values changing here. And in the bottom right, you can see the DSM I created. It is not fully clipped to the area of interest in this image. If I did this again, I would have done that prior to running the DEM and DSM just to be a little more efficient. Turning that into a raster. And then creating my NDSM, which you can see in the bottom right. So this is the last step on ArcGIS for a while. Then I transferred over to eCognition, but this is where you can really see the details of the timber harvest, even more from the remaining trees and the different harvest types, and even some of the road structures. And the NDSM is representing the remaining trees post-harvest and will act as the area in my volume calculation, which I will get into in a minute. So then transferring on to eCognition, here it is. And classification, eCognition, this is a general outline on getting through the segmentation on eCognition. My process is shown in a little more detail on the bottom image, and you can see the resulting segmentation on the right. I tried to break it down, showing adding the processes and the child processes and the relevant settings for that as well. And then you'll move on to classifying. You'll need to create classes to be more specific. I chose forest, pasture, and road. Pasture is not the intended use for the heavily cut areas. They're really aimed at more regeneration techniques and wildlife habitat. So I may change that wordage a little later on, but this is my general setup for classification. And I'm still working on these rule sets to get to a point where they can be inclusive of the class types, and then again, applied to applicable for other foresters and landowners in this region. So this is a rough SketchUp of the idea behind my volume calculations. Essentially, the white cylinder is representing a forest stand, and the gray cylinder is representing the timber that will be removed. So by taking the NDSM of both the total stand and the removed timber, I can essentially get the area, which is shown with the purple arrows. And then the height that I will need for the volume calculations will be determined from the average height of the trees. I might need to break that down a little more, but the tree heights are pretty universal because it is a pretty old stand of timber. To estimate the height of the removed timber, I will look at the trees surrounding the portions and then the pre-harvest data of that area to get their height averages. And then I am working to either find or create an estimation of the ratio of the trees that would be timber. This portion of West Virginia, there isn't much market for pulp products. So the volume estimation is based off of just timber volume from the trees, not the entirety of the tree. So that will be important to develop for my project. So some next steps moving on, I will continue to refine eCognition classification and create an interpretation key that can easily be applied to other forest stands, create and find that ratio I just talked about for total biomass volume to timber, and then compare the volume estimates that I create to the real world bid values. Some additional uses of this type of volume estimation could be to allow landowners or loggers to estimate timber volume on their own, to have a comparison to what is being bid out, creating another method for estimating carbon sequestering, which is becoming more and more relevant as we work to offset carbon emissions. It could also be used to ensure the proper amount of timber was removed, to ensure there was no timber theft, or that the proper management practices were set into place by the logger. And finally, another use could be to monitor regeneration of the forest over time. This is a very brief timeline of where I'm headed. So I'm taking 596B in spring 2. So I'm working to continue to develop my interpretation key for my classification, creating that detailed flow chart that can be used by forester, landowners, or loggers, and then find and present before graduation in May of 2023. And that concludes my presentation. I will now open the floor to any questions or feedback that you all may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I've raced mountain bikes at Cooper's Rock.
Oh, yes, they have a very large bike race there.
Yeah. One question I had as I was listening and thinking about your presentation was, how are you going? You'd made the statement that this was something that you're going to potentially allow other loggers and land users to use. How are you going to make this software technique available to them without the fancy eCognition software?
Yeah, that is a good point. I guess it would be aimed more at professionals who have that technology. You can do the classification and segmentation on ArcGIS. So I guess I could maybe do some sort of comparison to see if it is just as accurate, since that is a little more accessible for the general public. That's a really good point.
I mean, you know, timber cruising is a pretty labor intensive process. So I
Yes.
was just trying to think of something to alleviate a lot of that work. And obviously, you know, the technology is there. So just something to think about.
Yes, definitely.
People may be typing their questions.
Okay. All right, I have one from Anthony. It says, which of the future ideas do you most want to pursue if you had the chance beyond this project? I think honestly, the most interesting for me is the carbon sequestration portion. I think that is going to be even more relevant and important as time goes on. And I do know that currently the inventorying for that is very tedious. I think they use a 100% tally. So they are marking and tallying every single tree in the forest. So I think if that could become more efficient, that would be really useful in the future.
Anyone else have a question for Mary's project? Well, Mary, if you could just put your contact info in the chat so that if someone wants to follow up with you later, they can.
Yes, of course, no problem.
That'd be great.
Awesome.
But thanks again for a great presentation. Best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for listening.
Next up, we have a presentation by Kim Mock. Kim, if you want to start sharing your screen.
Okay, I will do that here from the beginning. Let's see here. Share my screen. Go. Share screen. There we go. Share. Okay. Good
All right,
morning,
yeah.
everyone.
Looks good.
Good. Okay, we're ready to go. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Mock, and my capstone proposal project is entitled Creating a Predictive Model for Suitable Nest Site Habitat for the Prairie Falcon in the Tule Lakes region of Northern California. I chose this picture because it's a really good representation of the environment. It's basically high desert, native shrub scrub, and the cliff you see in the background is very representative of prairie falcon nesting sites. So I'll give you a little bit of my background and how I got interested into this idea. My previous position, I worked for the USGS at the Western Ecological Research Center in Dixon, California. And I was hired as a GIS analyst. As a matter of fact, it was my first real GIS job. And I worked with the Greater Sage Grouse research team. And we used remote sensing techniques and GIS extensively to predict habitat for greater sage grouse, as well as coming up with habitat classifications for land managers so they could better manage the resources. The biggest project we did was for the state of Nevada's Sagebrush Ecosystem Council, and we analyzed 2/3 of the state of Nevada. The lower portion, of course, is very dry and not greater sage grouse habitat. And that's why it was just 2/3 of the area. So it really piqued my interest in utilizing remote sensing and GIS to predict habitat, wildlife, and habitat distribution. So additionally, a very good friend of mine did his master's thesis on prairie falcons. It was entitled Foraging Ecology of Prairie Falcons in Northern California. He did this in the late 70s, in 1976 and 1977. As a working biologist for the state of Idaho, he went back several occasions and completed additional data collection in 1998 and 2012. So there's this multi-temporal nature to this data. What is so interesting and what makes this data so important is that no additional studies on prairie falcon populations have been done. And that's just not only in this area, but throughout most of the Western US. I'll give you a little bit of background on the prairie falcon. It's the third largest falcon in North America. It's the only indigenous falcon species, and it's only found in the Western US. It's very heavily dependent on Belding's ground squirrels. That's the primary prey. The Belding's ground squirrels, very typical of a lot of ground squirrel species in the West during the late summer hot, dry period where the plants go dormant, they go dormant as well. And at that point, there's obviously not that major food source goes away. So most of the prairie falcons in the area disperse and leave the area. So it's the multi-temporal nature of this data that becomes extremely important with respect to climate change and persistent drought conditions. And as you all know, the West is experiencing long-term drought conditions. The news clip is from February of this year for Siskiyou County, and that is indeed where Tule Lakes region is located. And they broke the winter dry streak record this year. In the lower left is from the drought.gov website. It's a report of current conditions for Siskiyou County, and it indeed shows that they are in severe drought. That's the little black pinpoint there is Siskiyou County. The region kind of grayed out above it is the state of Oregon. The chart on the upper right is from a land cover data sheet report I downloaded for Siskiyou County from the MRLC data site, which stands for the Multi-Resolution Land Consortium. And it indeed shows that there's been habitat loss of the scrub, as well as grassland. So we've also, I found found some interesting papers on the effects of drought and prolonged winter conditions. And what they mean by that is longer periods of dormancy, for the plants that these animals feed on. The effects of drought and prolonged winter on Townsend's ground squirrels, which is the ground squirrel species in the same kind of scrub environment, but that's in southern Idaho. And the effects are pretty dramatic. Lower body mass, fewer litters, and fewer young in the litters. So one could ask then, what are the impacts of these on prairie falcons? So in a nutshell, my project scope and objective is to use remote sensing MGIS to construct a predictive model for nesting habitat for the prairie falcon in the Tule Lakes region of Northern California, using historical nest site data and habitat selection criteria. So Mr. Hawk has provided his data for me to use. I will use this, as I just said, in the predictive nest site model. Along with that, I'll have to determine what habitat features are being selected by this population for nesting activity. It varies from region to region. So for instance, prairie falcons in the Rocky Mountain region would quite possibly pick different habitat selection criteria So these will have to be established for the shrub scrub native habitat of this region. I will verify after the predictive model is built and constructed for potential nest site habitat. I will, in the spring summer of 2023, verify via field work in the area, and I'll determine what nest sites are active in the project area. This would include historical nest sites as well as potential new nest sites. I'll evaluate the accuracy of the predictive model based on the presence or absence of current nest site data. Also determine what land cover and land use changes have occurred during these 3 historical time periods of data collection. That would be the late 1970s, 1998, and 2012, and compare those land use changes to present day habitat conditions. And if changes have occurred in the number of nest sites when compared to the historical data, what factors or combination of factors might possibly be responsible for these changes? I'll be asking those questions. So a little bit about the project background. On the left is a project inset map that shows it's right along the border there of Oregon and Northern California. And as I said earlier, it's in the kind of the northwestern corner of the Basin and Range sagebrush habitat high desert area. On the right is the project study area of Tule Lakes. It's mostly in Siskiyou County, but it also includes a portion of Modoc County. And it's just north of the Lava Beds National Monument area. Here, I forgot to source this, so I apologize, but this is from the National Land Cover Database, the current data set, 2019, showing the land cover of the area, and the red dots are the prairie falcon data that I took and had to create XY data for it to be able to plot on the map. Bruce's data was all on hand typewriter sheets of latitude and longitude from the 70s. As you can see, the vast majority of these nest sites are located in shrub scrub habitat. But what's most important is that they are in close proximity to agricultural areas. And this is because the Belding's ground squirrel uses these agricultural areas for most of their food resources. Prairie falcons like to hunt in these agricultural areas because of the presence of Belding ground squirrels, but also because this is primarily alfalfa that they're growing. And so they get several seasons, several cuts of alfalfa. So it's typically clipped and clipped kind of short when they do it. So it's perfect primary hunting grounds for prairie falcons. As you can see, they're also not located in the forest areas. So the proposed methodology. So there are a number of predictive models that use remote sensing and GIS techniques to predict wildlife distribution. I found one in particular that I was very interested in that I'm using as a guideline for my research. The output is on the left. They used remote sensing and GIS to predict nest site suitability for the New Zealand falcon on the South Island. The New Zealand falcon is a threatened species. And you see the yellow areas here is the output of their predictive model, where they predict suitable nest site habitat will be. And the red dots are the nest site iris. And they also used historical data. So in the vast majority of these models, they pretty much followed the same methodology for creating the predictive model. It's in the assessment that they vary. So this is a brief outline of my methodology. I'll assemble and prepare the historic nest site data, which I've pretty much already done, put it into a GIS compatible format. I still need to gather, I need to gather the historical NLC data sets. I'm having difficulty locating late 1970s, early 1980s land cover, and I think I need to contact them and see if I can get something to fill that need. Same is true for satellite imagery. I investigated in Google Earth Engine for that time period and haven't come up with anything, which I was kind of surprised with Landsat, but so I don't know what the issue is, so I clearly need to investigate that further. I also need a digital elevation model for the habitat selection criterion in order to derive slope, aspect, and the elevation variables. I'll need some vector data, streams, lakes, and roads for evaluations as inputs for those habitat selection criteria. And I'll also need contour data. Step number 3 will be to determine habitat selection criteria for this population. And some of the variables probably will include topography of the area, most definitely, steepness of slope, and a ruggedness index. A ruggedness index was used in the New Zealand falcon study. And what they did was they looked at the contour density of that slope within the user-defined radius or buffer zone around each nest site, and they came up with a ruggedness index. Look at, of course, the vegetation of the area, and what's going to be very important is distance to hunting areas. Distance to human disturbance, while it might have played a larger role in the New Zealand falcon study, probably isn't going to be a huge factor in my study, just due to the remoteness of the area. It's not heavily populated. Step number 4 will be to prepare each habitat selection variable as a new grid layer. And then there's really, these input variables are going to be of 2 different types. One will be like minimum distance to a feature, such as a river or a road. And the other type is the occurrence of a feature within that buffer zone area. And I plan on this buffer zone to be primarily, most likely, the maximum distance of a home range for a nest site. Step number 5 will be to verify if the historical nest sites are currently active or not. That'll be in the field work this spring and summer, and hopefully locate new nest sites. Post-field work will include assessing the accuracy of my model, and I am more than welcome. I would welcome input on potential assessment methods for my study. My population sample or my nest site sample, data sample, is small, and I'm not so sure a lot of complex statistical methods are suitable. But I need to do additional research on this. But again, I would welcome some input on this. And I'll assess too if all the major habitat selection criteria are accounted for, or in other words, do I need to revise the model? So I'll also be analyzing the changes that have occurred between historical time and current conditions. What changes have occurred between different time conditions? Has the estimated home range of this population changed due to the need to increase their home range area for foraging for prey? What are the drought climate impacts, if any? Is there habitat degradation? These are just some of the questions I'll be asking. I obviously can't quantify them per se, but hopefully just a preliminary investigation will point to other research that might be needed in the future. So my project timeline, I will continue to do additional research on creating that habitat prediction model, a predictive model, as well as additional research on the natural history of this population. And I will hopefully get that predictive model ready to go in spring or summer. I'll do conduct my field work. And then after the field work, we'll assess the model for accuracy. At this point, as I said earlier, I'm still haven't quite decided. The New Zealand Falcon paper used a simple presence and absence model, and then they also use the student t-test to assess the accuracy. And then in the summer and fall, or excuse me, fall of 2023, I'll be taking 596B and completing my project write-up and presenting my paper at a conference. And these are the possible conference venues. I think the most likely one is the Raptor Research Foundation conference. It's in October. It kind of fits the timeline of my study better. And so my anticipated results, I do think there will be fewer nest sites due to the persistent drought conditions that have existed. I think the predictive model will accurately predict current nest site locations. Topography plays such a huge part in their selection. And I think the area obviously has experienced some change, but what are the extents and types of changes that have occurred? And what are the main causes that are driving these questions? I'd like to investigate these questions. And I would like to thank my advisor and Beth Fletcher King for her guideline through my entire master experience. And I'm finished, so I'll open it up to questions.
All right, Kim, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
While we wait for a question to pop up in the chat window, I was wondering, you mentioned several times the importance that the ground squirrels play in the habitat of the falcon. I wonder if there was any thought given toward being more direct with that data. In other words, incorporate the population, where the squirrels are. I don't know what specific kind of data would be available on that, but it seems to me that based on what you're reporting or what you communicated during your presentation, that taking a more direct approach with incorporating that data into your model may in fact be beneficial.
I completely agree, and I probably will do some further research to see if some of that data is out there. I came across an interesting paper that they used remote sensing to, and of course, a higher resolution than Landsat, but I believe they were probably using like NAPE data or perhaps aerial imagery that they acquired, and they were counting holes of ground squirrel holes to estimate the population. But a paper came out after that and discounted that was a very good method to estimate their population. Unfortunately, that would have been really neat to include. But so I agree. I'll see if there's that data. That would be a very important source. I thought I would, during the field work, try to assess the ground squirrel population and or habitat. That might be difficult. I'm just not sure at this point.
Okay, well, thanks. There's a question for you in the chat.
Okay. Sentinel, so Professor Sharma, hello there. Sentinel-2 imagery would likely be useful for habitat mapping at the 10-meter resolution. That's a wonderful suggestion. That would be great for the ground squirrels. Another question, have you had any luck finding vector data you need of streams, or do you think you might have to do it in ArcGIS yourself? No, there's quite a bit of stream data out there from the National Hydrology Data Set. Also through NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, they have a GIS data portal. They've got a lot of stream data, but that's a great question. Anthony, hello, Anthony. This is a super cool project, Kim. Let's see. I was also wondering the presence of the preferred prey. Do you think your model results may help other researchers who might be looking for the best locations in which to place game cameras where they might be able to conduct something akin to a census of squirrels? That's really an interesting idea. So here's part of the problem for prairie falcons. They're not an endangered species. So Fish and Game departments don't spend money on monitoring prairie falcons and or ground squirrels, which is a shame because with climate change conditions and the drought conditions, we really need to be looking at their populations. I mean, we're assuming they're stable, but we have no idea. So that's a very great idea. That's one of the main goals of my project is that I hope it points to other research that could be useful and get others, biologists to be interested in looking at that question. So that's a great idea. Another question, do you think you will find a secondary source of food for falcons? Well, so let's see, discovered the wolves, like Farley Mowat discovered that the wolves he studied were not subsisting on 100% caribou as he thought. They were eating mice. So we do know, Corey, that they do eat other things. And as a matter of fact, it's very interesting that they primarily feed on ground squirrels, both male and female. And then when the young start to hatch and they're feeding them, then the female goes exclusively to hunting ground squirrels and the males hunt smaller prey. And this, it's thought to occur because to increase their chances of catching food. So the males tend to pick on avian species, horned larks in particular, meadow larks, and field mice. So, but it's through a lot of studies, it's found that at least in this area, probably about 75% of their diet consists of ground squirrels.
One other possible avenue for your ground squirrel population metric is that ground squirrels are notorious for carrying fleas that carry the bubonic plague. And I know that there have been studies that have documented the distribution of those, not those specific squirrels in that area, but
right,
squirrels in general, because epidemiologists want to know where those squirrels would be habitating. So I don't know if that exists, but there may be some literature in the health epidemiology field that would at least give an indication as to what the pattern of ground squirrel habitat would be.
Right.
But I think from your standpoint, the interesting aspect would be how that pattern has changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that data actually exists or not.
Yeah, but no, it would be very interesting. Studies, a couple of the studies I found said, well, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself now, that they did impact ground squirrels dramatically. They had a lot less body mass, and of course the habitat. The severe habitat degradation is not only going to impact the ground squirrels, but the other species that feed on those plants. So the persistent drought conditions, I'm sure, have played a tremendous role in changes that have occurred.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, if you could put your contact info in the chat, that'd be great. And thanks again for a great presentation. Good luck with the rest of it.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening.
Next up, we have Adam Experin. So Adam, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, it'd be great.
Okay, just getting this up here.
Looks good from our end. So whenever you're ready.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adam Experin. This is my project presentation on improving accessibility of mental health resources for the American veteran community. This is the agenda we're going to go over for the next few minutes. Introduce myself a little bit, go over the problem, the background about the problem a little bit, the resources that are currently available, and then discuss the gap that those resources are still leaving. And then the rest of the presentation will just be going over the system that I look to build to help fill that gap. So a little bit about me. I am an 11-year Army veteran. I was a geospatial engineer for that 11 years in service. Got out in 2018 and now work as a geospatial or a GIS coordinator for a small city here in South Carolina. I'm also a current Veterans Health Administration mental health patient. I receive ongoing care for PTSD, and so this is a very important subject to me personally. I've lost several friends and soldiers during their time in the service, so meeting those mental health resources is something that's very important to me. Another thing about me, I'm also a Guitars for Vets instructor here in the local Charleston area, and then also a participant in Project Healing Waters fly fishing. So where those organizations are really important is kind of meeting the gap between what the VHA provides for veterans as they leave service, and kind of providing that camaraderie that is a common theme with veterans leaving the service, is that they miss the people. They don't necessarily miss the job, they miss the camaraderie of that shared experience from each other as they've gone through their time in service. So a little bit of background on that problem is the transition assistance program. Every service member has to go through one as they leave. But there are so many resources that are out there that those programs only have a limited amount of time to provide information on those resources. So it's really just an overview. For instance, if they're talking about veteran service organizations, they might tell you to get involved with them, such as the American Legion or Veterans of Foreign Wars, but they won't go into detail about what those service organizations actually provide and where they are or anything like that. So they're very limited in detail, and those transition programs are really focused on your post-service employment. They have a lot of great classes on building resumes and doing interviews and kind of what to expect in the federal employment process and things like that, but they don't go into as much detail about things like mental health resources or even medical resources, other than, hey, go and put in your claim with the VA, which actually leads me to the next point about the compensation and pension process. This process is basically to get VHA care for veterans once they leave service. And basically it's a process where the veteran says all the things that they've incurred injuries throughout their service, whether it's mental health or physical, broken bones or, torn their shoulder out, jumping out of airplanes, whatever the case may be, they go and they put in these claims. And then the VA actually goes over their medical records, both civilian and military, and reviews those to determine if it was actually service connected or if it was not. And then they provide care based on that service connection. For veterans just leaving the service, that process can take anywhere from 6 months to a year. Right now, I think a good friend of mine, he just started his process and he's sitting at 3 months and it's not making any progress at all. I've seen some people that have taken 18 months before they can actually get VHA care after leaving the service. Talking about those records for pre-Gulf War or global war on terrorism veterans, such as Vietnam veterans, Korean veterans, their records are even more limited than those that are currently in service, because before we went through the digital age, those medical records had to be mailed from duty station to duty station. And so a lot of times they would get lost or they would get misfiled. And so a lot of those records are limited or missing for those veterans. So that further delays care for them. Kind of going into the veteran suicide epidemic, why the need is there. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in veterans aged 18 to 44. It's only second to accidents, it's non-discriminative about whether it's a vehicle accident or some other form of accident. But suicide is the second leading cause of death, and at about 16.8 suicides per day, which is actually down from 22 around the 2018 period where it peaked. 47.8 veterans per 100,000 actually commit suicide in the first year following separation from service. So if we go back to that previous slide, some veterans are experiencing 6 months to a year, 18 months before they're actually receiving care in the Veteran Health Administration system. And so that first year is very critical on getting some kind of help or some kind of resource to help that veteran get through that period before they can get VHA care. There's a slightly higher chance of suicide in veterans that live in rural areas versus urban areas. And then looking at actual veterans that are getting care from the VHA, 58% have some form of mental health or substance abuse disorder. The rates of suicide in those documented mental health patients from 2001 to 2020 actually dropped 28.7%. So it shows the positive trend that care in the VHA system is actually having on those veterans. If you look at the chart to the right, you can see the lighter blue shows those VHA veterans that are receiving care, and you can see that it's significantly lower percentage of those veterans that are committing suicide than those that are not receiving care. So seeing that positive trend in the VHA system also makes you think that receiving care in third-party organizations, whether it's veteran service organizations or nonprofit organizations, would also help that as well. And one thing to note as well during this period is the actual number of suicides has increased over the last 20 years. However, the total population of veterans in the nation has actually dropped by almost 25%. So we're actually seeing a higher percentage of suicides to the total population. So we're trying to stop that trend as much as we can by getting as much help to more veterans as possible. So some of the VA resources that are currently out there, mentalhealth.va.gov provides a significant amount of resources and information for veterans and family members. You can explore by topic, category, depending on whatever your specific symptoms are. There's also a facility research locator that you can find facilities near you. And this is actually the premise of what we're trying to build as a solution for this problem. Some other resources, as I mentioned before, some state Veterans Affairs offices that complement the federal VA system, also provide some additional resources to veterans. Veteran service organizations like the American Legion, DAV, so forth. These organizations are really good for helping veterans get through the claims process with the VA. They provide transportation services to veterans, getting to and from their appointments. I mean, it's a huge list of things that these organizations do. So it's very critical for getting these resources in the hand of veterans. Nonprofit organizations tend to provide more of a specific opportunity focused resource to veterans, such as like Guitars for Vets provides guitar lessons to veterans. There's been studies show that veterans that use music, it actually engages more parts of the brain and actually helps to stave off some of the symptoms from PTSD, depression, anxiety, and helps to provide an outlet for veterans that makes their lives a little bit healthier. Project Healing Waters also provides a great camaraderie resource That's always the big thing, is that people miss spending time with other veterans. And some of these nonprofit organizations provide that, and it actually helps some veterans more than being in the VHA system and getting ongoing doctor care. All right, so that leads us to what the gap in those resources is left. And what I look as that gap is a tool that can assist transitioning and existing veterans find those mental health resources while they're waiting on VHA resources, and even afterwards. It needs to be something that's accessible by desktop and mobile device. And it has to have a way that a third-party organization can provide their information alongside the VHA. And it should be something that's location focused, so veterans can find things that are close to them and not just within their state or even within their county. So these are the goals and objectives that I see as the way forward in accomplishing this task. The biggest goal is to improve veteran awareness of VHA and third-party mental health resources after a veteran leaves service. I want to integrate the third-party information alongside VHA data into a single mapping interface. This is really the biggest problem, is that they're not coinciding with each other. And then I want to develop a web mapping application that can easily be shared through those transition assistance programs I talked about earlier, online forums like Reddit, and obviously through social media resources as well. And I want to author a form-based application that allows third-party organizations to reach a wider audience and provide the resources they have to veterans in need. So the concepts that I looked at for this project, I used the VHA facility locator map on mentalhealth.va.gov as really kind of the jumping off point. It was a really good idea. The only thing that was missing was that third-party organization component. I looked at the potential of building a new tool from scratch using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. That provides a huge amount of customization potential. However, my current knowledge level of using the API and then being able to put the right amount of time into or dedicating the right amount of time to producing a new application would just be longer than necessary. I also looked at building a tool with existing app frameworks such as ArcGIS configurable apps that are available on ArcGIS Online and in ArcGIS Enterprise. These provide little to or require little to no coding. There's less opportunity for you to be able to customize things, but it's a fast implementation because it's essentially a plug and play process. And then building a form-based application, as I mentioned before, to crowdsource that third-party data. So the concept that I selected was really a hybrid approach to be able to build a tool using those existing tools to build what's called a nearby instant app. It's a pre-configured application that essentially you use your data that you've already manipulated and set up to be able to share that application with the public, and they type in their location and it takes them directly to those resources that are nearest to them. The second thing was to configure a geoform based application to be able to crowdsource that data from third-party organizations. Again, this is an application that already exists that I would just have to configure and build the database from the front side or on the back end before sharing to ArcGIS Online for the public to use. These tools are already built and stable. They just need to be configured. So a lot of the onus for me is really going to be on the database production on the front end of the project and building the data that's going to go into these applications to make sure domains are set up properly, subtypes that will help with that attribute validation to ensure that the information that's going into the geoform that will then feed that nearby application will be as accurate as possible once it hits the application and the public can actually access it. By using tools that are already built and available, provides more time for me to spend on that database development instead of working on coding or something else. I can focus more on the pop-up functionality. I can work more on the feature layer design, making sure that everything functions as possible, as good as possible for the user experience at the end of the project. This is the proposed interface design, what it would look like to the user for these applications. On the left-hand side, you'll see the desktop application for the nearby map. Essentially, the user would put in their location in the upper left search bar, and then it would populate the user location in the map, and then they would find the nearest resources to that location and populate those on the left-hand side in a list. The iPhone sketch on the right-hand side would show what the geoform would look like on mobile. This would also be available on the desktop, which was shown on the previous slide with the geoform. Go back to that. This is a form that I've used in my current job before, and is really functional, really helpful in building storm damage information databases, so that we could send resources out to make sure that citizens received like the insurance information that they needed from the city in order to get storm damage covered by FEMA or by their insurance companies. So there would also be interface for the desktop and not just on mobile. This is what the anticipated architecture would look like. The GIS manager of the project or myself would do all the data manipulation at the ArcGIS Pro level, develop all that, develop the database and the geoform information. Once that database is complete, it would feed the geoform configurable app, which would then be used by the veteran organizations to crowdsource their information from the local area and be able to input their information in the app. That app would then feed ArcGIS Online, which would in turn feed the nearby instant app that'll be accessible by public web link by veterans around the country. So the current data available, there is, like I've mentioned a couple times already, the facility locator. Where this would be really helpful in this project is it is able to filter by mental health facilities or facilities that provide mental health resources. So I could actually use that to tailor down the mass amount of information that you can see in the bottom image on the right. There's a huge amount of VHA locations across the country, and being able to tailor that down to just the mental health, facilities would really help on getting the right resources to the veteran at the right time. So I want to be able to color code those based on mental health facilities versus standard care facilities. The VHA locations shapefile itself does not highlight the mental health resources exclusively. It doesn't separate which ones are mental health facilities like it does in the facility locator, but it is easily updatable by through the ArcGIS hub. So as new facilities are added, we would be able to add those to the application. Third-party locations, you could do some data mining to put in those locations using the websites or finding local chapters and putting that information in essentially one at a time, putting it in manually. But you're limited to the user's knowledge of what organizations exist. And so there's so many different, especially nonprofit organizations out there. There's so many out there that it would be impossible for one person or two people to know all of them. And so that's where crowdsourcing really comes in, and being able to disseminate that opportunity to those third-party organizations, whether it's through newspaper, news, social media, online forums, whatever the case may be, getting that information out there can causes little to no resource costs, and it also gets you more of a return that frankly, you might not have even expected in the first place. So the only thing that is kind of a downside for crowdsourcing is it does rely on that word of mouth. And then also some of that data quality can be inconsistent or unreliable. For instance, if they're typing in a summary of resources, any kind of grammatical errors or incorrect information, you're kind of putting a lot of trust and faith into the people inputting the information to put it in right. And so you can have some of those inconsistencies in the data that is input into the GeoForm. This is the system model. It's very similar to the anticipated architecture. Essentially, the GIS manager would configure the applications. The third-party organization would access via a public web link. They would access the GeoForm. Those data inputs would feed the nearby app. The initial database design from the GIS manager would feed ArcGIS Online, which would also in turn feed the nearby app that's accessible by the veteran user through a public web link. And they would put in their location, which would return data based on those location inputs. How we would go about system evaluation. The biggest part of this is going to be how do we test getting third-party information into the application, and as well as testing the veteran side application to make sure the functionality is there that is going to actually benefit the veteran. The data manipulation test is really just going to be testing to make sure pop-ups work correctly, the data is organized correctly by type. When you click on an icon, it pops up the correct location and contact information for the organization in question. So that would basically be the first test, just to make sure that information is being fed into the nearby app for the veteran side application to be able to search. The third-party data input test, I plan to recruit volunteers from local VSO and nonprofits here in the Charleston area, have them use the GeoForm both on a mobile device and on desktop to check that user experience, and then evaluate the use of the domains and attribute rules for them putting in the data and making sure that it actually results in the correct features being added to the application. And then finally, I'll discuss that user experience and how the functionality can be improved for the veterans and for these organizations. Testing the veteran side application, I would do the same thing with recruiting some volunteers to put in that information, to test it out and make sure that the search functions work correctly. The biggest thing that I want to make sure works correctly is that the VHA locations and the third-party locations are both returned in the search results. Right now, I would consider them being in two separate web layers, one being the VHA locations, the other being the third-party locations being fed in through the GeoForm. So I want to make sure that the search function works to search both of those feature layers in order to return the nearest facilities to the veteran in each of those. So that I think that'll be the biggest unknown right now. The other option is being able to put those two layers into a single layer, and then that way the nearby functionality would search just that one layer and find the closest points to the user's location. And then finally, I would discuss that user experience as well with those volunteers and see how it could have been a little better for them. Future work moving forward, it would be the data manipulation is going to be, like I said before, probably the biggest part of this project. Between the actual data manipulation, developing the third-party feature class, making sure those domains and relevant information fields are all present in the database. For the VHA data, the biggest thing is going to be separating out those mental health facilities versus the standard care, and being able to make sure that the correct information for those facilities is included. Finally, after the data is all set up in its proper format, we'll then go forward with developing the applications themselves. We'll work on the geoform first, and then work on the nearby app, since the information from the geoform will feed the nearby app and go in that order. And then we'll conduct the system evaluation that we discussed in the previous slide, evaluate those results and the user feedback, implement any changes as necessary, and then looking forward to spring 2023, we'll then prepare and present those results. This is the proposed timeline for spring A. As you can see, the project planning really take about a week. Do any data mining for VSO locations, some nonprofits in the area that I could manually include, do any data manipulation over the next 2 weeks after that, then start development of the geoform and the web application, and then conduct the pilot test at the beginning of March into February, and then evaluate those results before preparing and presenting findings. These are the references I used. The biggest one through here is really the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Suicide Prevention Annual Report. There's a lot of great information that can be used for determining some of the background for this and why it's important, as well as the veteran health medical facilities, being able to dig into that and see where facilities currently are, and seeing some of the gaps in locations where there could be a lot of veterans, however, there's not a lot of resources. And so I think that's something moving forward I'd like to see a little more of, is determining locations that have a high volume of veterans but low volume of resources, and maybe use that to drive more resources to those areas. And pending any questions, that's all I have for my presentation.
All right, Adam, thank you very much. Great job. While we're waiting, oh, looks like you have a question in the chat window.
Okay, just nice job and kudos for doing this project, with the crowdsourcing aspect being an important piece. How you'll get the word out. The biggest thing about getting the word out about the project, I think, is really getting some buy-in from state GIS departments, especially going through, as I mentioned, those state Veterans Affairs offices, trying to use those, their network of people, and then also using social media for each individual state. Like, I'm focusing on my local area, but I think this is something that's easily scalable to the state level, and then state, regional, and then national. I think that's the biggest first step. I think would be going through those state Veterans Affairs offices to use their network of veterans, access to those veteran support organizations that already exist.
One comment, not really a question, but a comment that I had, is that you talked about including folks to kind of give a preview or a pre-analysis, if you were, of your dashboard or the interface. Have you thought maybe about including some kind of a perennial feedback mechanism, so that as users work on and with your application, that they can provide you with maybe not real time, but close to real time feedback on changes to functionality or interface or those kinds of ideas?
You mean like as they put in the information, if they have feedback, how to provide that to me?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily like in real time, but at some point have some sort of a mechanism that they can provide feedback, you know, like this button could be a different color or add different fields, or, you know, something along those lines.
Right. Yeah, I think I know with a lot of the configurable apps, they have an option for like the splash screen. I would have to look at some kind of, something along those lines, or even adding a separate button. Maybe that's a customization you can add with the JavaScript API to be able to add that in the configurable app, or being able to just have like a provide feedback button or something that where they could just send a note, or it opens their email and allows them to send an email or something like that. I think that would be something that could be implemented as well.
Yeah, I think that would be a nice nice addition to your tool. Obviously, it's a very important topic, and one that affects quite a number of veterans. So any way to give you input on how to make the application better, I think would be a good addition.
Absolutely. Thank you for the idea.
Anyone else have a question for Adam? Adam, if you could put your contact information in the chat window, so if someone wants to follow up with you later, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for patiently waiting through my presentation.
Our final presenter for today is Michael Vasquez. So Michael, if you want to start sharing your screen.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
You're loud and clear.
All right.
We can see your presentation, so whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right. So my proposal is on modeling soil erosion in the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed using GIS and the revised universal soil loss equation. And here we have a picture of a section of the Chattahoochee River, and provides more clean drinking water than any other water body to residents here in Georgia. Very, very, important water resource for us, which is one of the reasons I wanted to focus specifically with the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed, which is, thinking about it, is a sub-basin really that's located near the headwaters of the Chattahoochee River. So we'll get into it. So first, a little bit of background on the watershed. So the Chattahoochee, Smith Creek Chattahoochee watershed is mostly around like 99% of it is located in White County, Georgia. And it consists of about 17,486 acres of fairly rugged mountainous terrain. The topography within the watershed also produces a slight variation in climate. So for example, at higher elevations, we'll get an average around 5 to 10 degrees cooler than at the valley floor. And areas within the watershed can also receive an increase of, and in some cases more than 10 inches of average annual rainfall. The current land use makeup of the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed is primarily deciduous forest with some pasture land for livestock grazing, and straw hay cultivation, and the city of Helen, Georgia, which is the biggest kind of developed area in this watershed, though it's not a crazy large city by any means. And also there are no commercial agricultural facilities within the watershed. So a little bit more, so in pursuit of Section 319 of the Clean Water Act, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Environmental Protection Division delineated all the priority watersheds within the state, and the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed is one of these priority watersheds, and it's also again located near the headwaters of the Chattahoochee River. In 2013, reporting to the Environmental Protection Agency, Georgia named Lake Lanier its #1 priority water in the state. Lake Lanier is a dam section of the Chattahoochee River watershed that's around 40 miles south of the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed. In 2018, the Georgia Mountains Regional Commission also published a watershed management plan for the upper Chattahoochee River watershed. The Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed is one of 6 contiguous subbasins that together make up the larger, again, Chattahoochee River watershed. And over here on the legend of the map to the right, we can see some of the main, some of our main waterways, surface waters, and HUC 120313, that number is a number that's assigned to the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed in their inventory system. So a little bit more kind of background on the watershed. So there are 54.17 miles of streams, creeks, and rivers delineated within the watershed on the map to the right here. And of that, 19.3 of these miles are designated as impaired streams by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Environmental Protection Division. And we could see our blue layer is just our, again, our hydro layer. We see the purple, that's our impaired streams, and then the flag locations, those are the sample locations where the Georgia EPD, they have a monitoring program where they take routine samples of those locations. So here's some attribute data for these sample locations. Here's some attribute data for the impaired streams. And I guess really the one of the important things to take away from this is that we're looking, this is all a byproduct of the Clean Water Act, and a big part of the Clean Water Act is meeting the intended uses of our waters. And right here in this assessment, we see in the attribute table, we have 3 of our impaired streams that are not supporting their intended uses. We also see some causes for that over here to the right. And those sections are sections of the Chattahoochee River, the Smith Creek, and the Chattahoochee River. So we'll look at this on a map over here to the right. So of those 19.3 miles of impaired stream, again, there were those 3 segments we just looked at that did not support their intended uses, and we have those highlighted here in green. So that was a little bit of background on the watershed, and now it's time to talk about the revised universal soil loss equation. And before we get into that, we're going to start with just a quick kind of refresher on erosion. So erosion is going to be the detachment of sediment at the surface level by water, wind, ice, and or gravity. And while a natural process, erosion can be accelerated by human activities like agricultural practices, urbanization, development, and the removal of riparian vegetation. As land use types are changed from one to another, sediment exposed during earthwork operations can become prone to erosion, and guided by gravity, stormwater runoff from rain events can wash away the surface layer of sediment where poor soil conservation practices are utilized. The image to the left, to the far left, we can see riparian vegetation has been removed along this stream buffer. And when we do that, where the soil, that stream bank is becoming much more prone to erosion, the root structure of those trees is being removed. And again, as we can see, large amounts of that stream buffer is just casting off and eroding into the river there. To the bottom right, we can see this is an area that was cleared either for commercial or maybe for agricultural use, but for whatever reason, it was left idle for some time. And as a result, we have a fairly large gully washout erosion. And to the top, we can see a welcome sign to Helen, Georgia. This is our single urbanized town area within the watershed, and you can kind of see the mountains in the background. Again, it's a fairly mountainous, rugged watershed. So a little bit more background on soil erosion and why this is important. So research by the Georgia Soil and Water Conservation Commission has shown that the expected soil erosion rate for forested land is around 1 ton per acre per year, farmland around 5 tons per acre per year, and a construction site where clearing and grading operations are going to take place around 45 tons per acre per year. This risk represents a potentially enormous burden on the receiving waters within these watersheds. If it's excessive amounts of sediment is being discharged into rivers, creeks, and streams, then the aquatic life, aquatic habitat, and water quality will suffer. And we could see confluence here, where we have some very turbid water entering with the Chattahoochee River, a section just south of the watershed we're studying in this example. But here is just a pretty clear-cut image of, poor soil conservation practices being utilized and a kind of a worst-case situation. And kind of finishing up on this one, so another factor to consider when discussing the impact of soil erosion and sedimentation, as the bottom of a river, creek, or stream is filled with excessive amounts of sediment, the conveyance capacity of that feature decreases, resulting in more flood events and maintenance costs. In the United States, the Federal Clean Water Act has established a set of rules and regulations to help protect the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. Within the Federal Clean Water Act, the United States Environmental Protection Agency has identified sediment as the #1 non-point source pollutant, making the ability to accurately model soil erosion an increasingly valuable tool for watershed management efforts. And the image to the right just highlights a few of the benefits of stream buffers or riparian vegetation, filtering pollutants from stormwater runoff, protecting stream banks from erosion, reducing flood damage, wildlife habitat, et cetera, et cetera. So these are a couple areas within the watershed, the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed we're analyzing, where stream buffers have been removed along Horton Creek, and we can see that to the top and to the bottom right. And this is farmland where the buffers have been removed, most likely just to utilize more farmable land. And then the image to the top right, from right to left, we can see the Chattahoochee River running north of the city, and then it cuts kind of right through the middle of it as you get closer to the you move closer west or to the left. Another image here, if we look to the top, we can see East Fork Smith Creek above, where riparian vegetation or stream buffers have been removed, and also a section where it's going under a bridge. That would be an area too. It just says it's removed, that an area that you would want to make sure that it's being routinely monitored, whether it needs to be, if vegetation is suitable there, that's fantastic. If it needs some kind of like hard armoring, retaining walls, riprap, whatever, just to prevent erosion. That's why I kind of highlighted the image to the right too. So this is the Chattahoochee River. We could see another bridge here where we have that potential erosion source. Also, I put this one on here as well. We do have some buffers that are removed, and we have some parking lots that are really, really close to the river. Just maybe kind of highlighting some poor planning. Ideally, I don't think you'd put that there now. So again, kind of wrapping up with some of the impacts of soil erosion. So nephelometric turbidity unit, or NTU, is a measurement for turbidity in water as determined by the degree of light it's scattered at right angles when compared to standard reference solutions. Studies conducted by the United States Environmental Protection Agency have shown that increases in turbidity levels can lead to a decrease in dissolved oxygen levels within the waterway, a decrease in resistance to disease among fish populations, disruption during larval and egg development stages for aquatic life, clogging fish gills, and a decrease in sunlight penetration through the water. In the image, the bottom images here, again, turbidity or NTU, we see some water samples, and the numbers below are going to represent different levels. So 10 NTUs, 25, 50. As we can see, we get higher up, we have more sediment in the water. There's, again, we're going to expect to have decreased levels of dissolved oxygen, decreased levels of sunlight penetration, etc. The image to the bottom left is going to show how we measure turbidity. So we have a light source that's going to shoot, if we look at the image from left to right, that's going to shoot through our sample jar. We have a detector at a right angle, 90-degree angle, to that sample jar, or to that light source. And that's kind of where the magic happens. That's where we're going to find what level of turbidity that water sample has. And the the image at the top is actually from a study on turbidity that was done in Poland, and it was done in like a mountainous area that was heavily forested, and they started having timber harvesting operations had begun, and they wanted to they did a series of tests just on water quality, on ecology to see how it was affecting fish, macroinvertebrates. And I like this image because it's really simple, makes it just a nice clean picture. But as we, one of the side effects of having turbine-laden water, excessive amounts of sediment in the water, is that as it settles out, it's going to fill up a lot of these spaces where spawning and macroinvertebrate and fish spawning in habitats would have been, making it less likely for them to survive. Also making like where they're living at, their populations less dense as well, so they're going to have to scatter more. All right, so moving into the revised universal soil loss equation, or Russell as it's commonly referred to, and this is a quantitative approach to predicting soil loss through 6 input factors: rainfall runoff erosivity factor, a soil erodibility factor, slope length factor, slope steepness factor, a land cover management factor, a conservation, practice factor. And to the left, we have the equation. So A is equal to R times K times L times S times C times P. And this is an average annual soil loss in tons per acre. The Russell equation has been a staple in soil and water conservation efforts since its inception in the early 20th century. Today, these 6 factors can be represented as raster layers using GIS software and then used to model soil erosion within an area of interest. So moving on to the goals and objectives. To accurately model soil erosion in the Smith Creek and Chattahoochee River watershed with Russell and GIS, and to also compare the results with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Environmental Protection Agency's impaired stream section. So the proposed methodology, moving along into our first factor, our rainfall runoff erosivity factor, commonly referred to as R factor. And this quantifies the effect of raindrop impact and must also reflect the amount and rate of runoff likely to be associated with the rain event. So my plan here is to digitize this ISO erodent map that the EPA produced some years ago. And when I do that, I'm going to interpolate a raster surface from the R factor values. And from there, I'm going to clip the raster to the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed. So the next factor is the soil erodibility factor, the K factor. And this accounts for the influence of soil properties on soil loss during storm events. And to the left, we have a soil series map of the watershed all the way to the left. And then just immediately to the left from the text, this is the K factor map, or the soil erodibility factor map. And so my plan is, again, to download this K factor map, and I'm going to clip that raster to the watershed boundary. All right, so the slope length factor. So this accounts for the effect of topography within the Russell equation. And my plan is to download the digital elevation models for the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed and create a mosaic data set with the DEMs. From there, raster clip and create the necessary raster data sets listed below. And this is the equation that's used to calculate the slope length factor. So flow accumulation, our elevation model resolution, we have some constants, and then we have to create a slope of the DEM as well. So the proposed methodology for the land cover management factor, or the C factor. This evaluates the land use types that make up an area of interest. The C factor is based on a standard deviation from the value of 1. So I plan to download satellite imagery, create training samples for forest, pasture, grass, and developed areas, and then classify the image. From there, I can assign C factor values to each to get my C factor raster data set. So the conservation practice factor, or the P factor, this is going to analyze soil conservation efforts made within the watershed. The P factor is based on a standard deviation from value 1. And so it's a similar path to the previous one. So I'm going to plan to download satellite imagery, create training samples for forest, pasture, grass, and develop land conservation efforts, and then classify the image. From there, I can assign P factor values to each input within that raster. And here to the right, we could see too, just in our watershed, the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed, its overwhelming majority is going to be forest, steep cliffs and forests. We're going to have some pasture land in the valley areas. And then we have our developed section, or our developed city there of Helen. So finally, I will use the raster calculator to multiply each input data set to generate a final product. This is going to show the areas most prone to soil erosion on an annual basis in terms in tons per acre. And over here to the right, we have an example kind of model builder here of how this can be set up. Again, I'm using a different approach for the P factor, the support conservation practice factor. I'm going to be using a similar approach to the C factor for that one, but everything else is aligning is pretty standard for this workflow, but that gives just a better idea of what it all looks like coming together. So my project timeline. So the first 3 weeks, I'm going to be looking at data acquisition and refinement, just getting everything where it needs to be. But my goal is to have everything at a 15-meter resolution. Weeks 4 through 6, this is where I'm going to really start getting all the raster data sets together, really kind of getting on the final presentation after I get that and get that completed too. But again, really get in at the raster data set creations there. And again, finally finishing the final presentation. So a few conference ideas. I'm still working through this, but just a few that I've listed here. One of them is 2023. They're all 2023, but the 2023 National Watershed and Stormwater Conference in San Diego. Erosion Control Day in Athens, Georgia. This one is put on by the Georgia Soil and Water Conservation Commission and the University of Georgia. It's held on their campus. I'm usually at that one every year, and they usually have a couple hundred people there. It's a good time. Another conference I was looking at too is an MS4 Stormwater Conference. It's not the exact same, but we're still kind of in the same ballpark here with it. This one's in Chattanooga. I'm still kind of, like I said, still kind of working with my advisor to find the right one. So my anticipated results. I'm anticipating that there will be relatively low soil erosion levels within the Smith Creek Chattahoochee River watershed. However, the steep mountain slopes, along with areas where riparian vegetation has been removed, provide some level of concern. The sections of the Chattahoochee River that travel along and through downtown Helen may also have higher levels within the analysis. Now, I also expect that the areas surrounding the impaired streams not supporting their intended uses as delineated by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Georgia Department of Natural Resources Environmental Protection Division is not going, or it's going to, I'm expecting there to be a correlation between the two, that those areas are not supporting their intended uses are also going to be areas where we do find levels of higher soil erosion. And with that, pull up my references. I'm sorry, it was kind of difficult. I kept messing up trying to get everything in alphabetical order and listed neatly in PowerPoint, but these are the references I use for my presentation. And at this point, I will turn it over to any questions.
All right, thanks, Mike, for a great presentation. And while we wait for some questions to pop up in the chat window, I was wondering if you thought about any way to sort of validate your model run. Mike, are you still there?
Yep, I'm sorry. I had been muted, but yeah. So speaking of that, so one of the things I want to do, and I didn't touch on that, but is to do just to run the model on the as is on what things are like now in the watershed, and then also maybe influence the conservation number a little bit more positive and a little bit more negative, just to see a little bit of the effect of employing some of these soil conservation practices and what it can how it can influence the entire equation.
Sure, that makes sense. I also thought maybe that you could look at a different kind of surface topography or different land classification that adjoin the stream to get a variety of data in your model.
Okay.
Does anyone have a question for Mike? All right, well, Mike, if you could put your contact info in the chat window, that'd be helpful if someone wants to provide comment.
Okay.
It actually looks like you do have a question in your in the chat window.
So you plan to weight any of your variables in the model? So no, I'm going to be running it. So that's a good question. I was thinking of when I was going into it, I was kind of expecting to do an overlay analysis and have the weighted inputs. And one of the benefits of doing the having all the raster surfaces too is that you can assign just those numeric values to each one of the kind of delineated areas within each raster, and just use the raster calculator to get that actual number. So yeah, I did think about that, and that was actually my initial plan going into it, was yeah, to weight the rasters. But however, yeah, I found that this was just going to be a little bit better to get a little bit more precise numbers on soil erosion within the watershed.
All right, so yeah, if you could put your contact info in the chat window, that'd be helpful.
Oh, yeah.
All right, well, I thank everyone for joining us today for 596A presentations. Best of luck to all the capstone projects, and hope that they get all completed and come back with some amazing results. And we'll look forward to hearing from them hopefully sometime in the future. So have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.